When my boss tried to frame me to hide his fraud, he thought I would stay silent. But the truth cannot be buried forever, and I knew one day his lies would collapse. My name is Claire Bennett, and this is how my courage turned his empire into dust. For almost 8 years, I worked as a financial analyst at one of the largest corporations in New York City, Hale Dynamics Inc. To the world outside, it was a shining empire of glass and chrome, a place where dreams turned into fortune. To me, it was a battlefield of numbers, deals, and endless deadlines. I wasn't the kind of employee who stood out in the crowd. I was quiet, dedicated, the one who always stayed late to double-check the numbers everyone else missed. People in the office barely noticed me, but I knew that numbers tell the truth, and sometimes they tell the kind of truth no one wants to hear. I wasn't born into wealth. My father was a mechanic, and my mother worked as a school teacher. I clawed my way up through sheer hard work, often sleeping just a few hours each night while I studied finance. When I finally landed the job at Hale Dynamics, it felt like I had stepped into another world. Everyone admired the CEO, Richard Hale. He was tall, confident, a man whose words dripped with charm and power. Investors adored him, the media praised him, and employees feared him in equal measure. Richard had the kind of charisma that made you believe in impossible growth, in endless success. But soon I began to notice small things that didn't add up. An invoice that disappeared from the records. A transfer labeled as consulting, with no name attached. Money moving in circles and reappearing under different accounts. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake, or maybe I was just tired from the long nights at my desk. But as the patterns repeated, the truth stared me in the face. These weren't errors. This was fraud. Carefully built, perfectly hidden, designed so that no one would ever question it. One late night, as I sat alone in the office with only the city lights glowing through the tall windows, I realized the depth of it. Richard wasn't just a businessman with ambition. He was a fraud hiding behind his empire, and the empire was built on lies. The very next morning, Richard called me into his office. His glass-walled suite was more like a throne room than a workplace, towering over the city skyline. He smiled at me in that smooth, practiced way. "Claire, you've been doing excellent work," he said. But then his eyes hardened, and his voice dropped lower. "I've heard you've been looking a little too closely at certain files. Let me give you some advice. Smart people know when to stop asking questions." My heart stopped. He knew. Somehow he already knew I had seen too much. I forced myself to smile politely, nod, and walk out of his office as if nothing had happened. But inside I was trembling. That was the moment I understood. I was no longer just an employee. To Richard, I had become a threat. After that, the office turned cold. Meetings I used to attend suddenly excluded me. Reports I prepared were altered before submission. Colleagues who once greeted me warmly now looked the other way. Then came the memo, accusing me of negligence in financial oversight. Me, negligent? I was the one who caught everyone else's mistakes. It was a blatant lie, a trap to destroy my credibility before I could open my mouth. Richard was framing me, setting me up so that if I ever spoke out, no one would believe me. That night, I sat in my small apartment, staring out at the city skyline. My career, my reputation, my entire life's work, it was all hanging by a thread. I thought of my parents, the sacrifices they made to put me through school, the endless nights I had spent chasing this dream. Was I really going to let him take it all away? I couldn't. I wouldn't. Staying silent would mean I was complicit, and if I allowed him to bury the truth, then I would become just another piece of his corruption. So I made my choice. Quietly, secretly, I began to fight back. Every night after the office was empty, I gathered evidence. I saved emails, copied ledgers, traced transactions through hidden accounts. I even photographed contracts Richard thought no one would ever question. Piece by piece, I built a wall of proof so strong that even his lies couldn't break it. But the more evidence I collected, the more dangerous it became. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to slip. Richard was powerful, and he had friends in high places. If he destroyed my name first, it wouldn't matter what evidence I had. No one would believe me. Weeks later, the final blow came. I wasn't invited to the board meeting, but I happened to see the agenda printed and left behind on the office printer. My blood froze when I read the words, "Termination of Claire Bennett, grounds of negligence. He was going to fire me. Not quietly, not behind closed doors, but publicly, branding me as a failure, ruining my career forever. But what Richard didn't know was that I was ready. Because in my hands I held the truth, and soon, that truth would burn down everything he had built. When I walked into the office the next morning, something felt different. Conversations hushed the moment I stepped into the room. Eyes followed me as though I had suddenly grown horns. People who once greeted me with polite smiles now whispered behind their hands. I knew why. Richard's agenda was already spreading. The narrative had been set in motion. Claire Bennett, the negligent analyst who failed to protect the company. By noon, my supervisor called me into a meeting. His voice was stiff, rehearsed, as though every word had been chosen for him. "Claire," he said, avoiding my eyes, "serious concerns have been raised about your oversight of the financial reports. The board is discussing your position." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the fear in his eyes silenced me. He wasn't the enemy. He was just another pawn in Richard's game. I thanked him for the update and left the room, but my hands were shaking. The walls were closing in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should just quit before Richard destroyed me completely. But then, in the quiet darkness, I remembered every long night I had worked, every sacrifice I had made, every small victory I had earned on my own. I wasn't going to let him take that from me, not without a fight. So the next day I doubled down. After hours, when the office was nearly empty, I slipped back to my desk. I dug deeper into the accounts, tracing lines of money that twisted like a web. The more I looked, the more I uncovered. Richard wasn't just moving small amounts of cash. He was rerouting millions through shell companies, hiding them as consulting fees, partnerships, and research investments. Entire deals existed only on paper, carefully constructed illusions that propped up the company's value. It was brilliant in its design, terrifying in its scale. If the fraud ever surfaced, Hale Dynamics would crumble overnight. Thousands of employees would lose their jobs. Investors would lose fortunes. And Richard knew it, which was why he was desperate to keep me silent. One evening, as I copied another batch of files onto my encrypted drive, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart nearly stopped. I slammed the laptop shut, forcing a smile as I turned. It was Julia, one of my colleagues. "You're still here?" she asked, her eyes flicking to my desk. "Yeah, just catching up," I lied. But the way she looked at me told me she didn't believe it. Julia had been friendly once, even shared coffee breaks with me, but now there was suspicion in her gaze. I realized then that I could trust no one. The walls of the office weren't just glass. They were mirrors, reflecting every move back to Richard. The next morning, an official email hit my inbox. I was to appear at the upcoming board meeting. The subject line read like a death sentence. "Performance review, urgent." I knew what that meant. They were going to make an example of me, pin everything on me, and walk me out in disgrace. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had something Richard didn't expect. Proof. The night before the meeting, I sat in my apartment surrounded by files, papers scattered across the floor, the hum of my laptop filling the silence. I reviewed every piece of evidence I had collected. Each email was a nail, each ledger a crack in his empire. I organized them carefully, building a timeline of his fraud so clear no one could deny it. Still, fear gnawed at me. Richard was powerful, and powerful men didn't fall easily. He had lawyers, board members, even politicians in his pocket. What if they all sided with him? What if I ended up not just jobless, but blacklisted in the entire industry? But then I thought of something else. What if I stayed silent? What if I let him bury me? He would keep stealing, keep lying, and more innocent people would suffer. I couldn't live with that. The day of the board meeting arrived. I walked into the sleek conference room, my heart hammering. The long mahogany table gleamed under the lights, surrounded by stern-faced board members in tailored suits. Richard sat at the head of the table, his smile sharp as a blade. "Claire," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we're here to discuss some very serious concerns about your performance." He presented charts and reports, altered, doctored documents that painted me as careless, incompetent. I watched as board members frowned, nodding along. Richard was good, Too good. He knew how to twist reality until the truth looked like a lie. When he finished, he turned to me. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Every eye in the room was on me. My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to stand. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of files I had prepared. Yes, I said, my voice steady. I do. I laid the evidence on the table. Emails, bank transfers, contracts. I explained the patterns, the shell companies, the money trails that led straight back to Richard. At first, the board members looked confused, skeptical, but as I spoke, the room grew quieter. Faces hardened. Richard's smile faltered. You're lying, he snapped. These are fabricated. Then why? I cut him off. Do the signatures on these documents match yours? I slid a contract across the table. Richard's name glared back in bold ink. For a moment, the entire room was silent. Then the whispers began. Board members leaned toward one another, brows furrowed. Richard's mask cracked. I saw panic flicker in his eyes. That was when I knew. I had him, but it wasn't over. Richard wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. He straightened, his voice rising. Do you understand what you're doing, Claire? You're destroying this company. Thousands of jobs. Everything we've built. I held his gaze. No, Richard. You destroyed it the moment you chose lies over truth. The board members looked torn, caught between the empire Richard had built and the evidence I had laid before them. I didn't know what decision they would make, but one thing was certain. The story had changed. I was no longer the accused. Richard was. As I left the room that day, I felt the weight of every eye on me. Fear still lingered, but beneath it burned something stronger. Resolve. This was just the beginning. Richard Hale had tried to frame me, but now his empire was crumbling, and I wasn't going to stop until the truth buried him completely. When I walked out of that boardroom, my heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one being accused. I had shifted the weight of suspicion onto Richard Hale himself. Yet as the heavy doors closed behind me, I knew this wasn't victory. Not yet. Men like Richard didn't go down because of one meeting. They fought, clawed, manipulated until their last breath, and I knew he would come for me harder than ever before. The office atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Whispers followed me everywhere I went, but they weren't the same whispers as before. Now it wasn't Claire messed up. It was, did you hear what she said about the CEO? People avoided my gaze, some out of fear, others out of curiosity. A few even looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. But Richard was still in his chair. He still had the title, the power, and the resources. The board hadn't made any official decision that day. They said they needed time to review the evidence. I knew what that meant. Richard was lobbying behind closed doors, spinning his story, twisting the truth, doing everything he could to keep control. 2 days later, I received an anonymous email. No subject line, no signature, just a single sentence. Be careful who you trust. He's not finished with you. My blood ran cold. It could have been from anyone, a colleague, a board member, even someone outside the company. But the message was clear. Richard wasn't going down quietly. That night, as I walked home, I felt the city different around me. Every shadow seemed deeper, every set of footsteps behind me heavier. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half convinced someone was following me. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was real. When I reached my apartment, I found the door slightly open. My chest tightened. I lived alone, and I was certain I had locked it that morning. Slowly, I pushed the door open. My living room was exactly as I had left it. No broken windows, no missing items. But when I reached my desk, I froze. The files I had left neatly stacked were scattered. My laptop was open, though I had shut it before leaving. Someone had been here. Someone had searched through my things. Panic clawed at my throat. I checked the hard drive where I had stored Richard's files. It was gone. For a moment, the world tilted beneath me. All those weeks of careful work, all my proof, vanished in an instant. My legs almost gave way, but then I noticed something. The decoy drive I had left in the desk drawer was missing, not the real one. My actual evidence was hidden in a safe place no one would ever think to look. Whoever had broken in had taken the bait. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with terror. Richard knew I had proof. He had just tried to take it from me. The next morning, I walked into the office, forcing myself to appear calm. Richard's eyes met mine across the hallway. For the first time, his confident mask was gone. What I saw instead was anger, raw, burning, dangerous. He gave me a thin smile, but it wasn't the kind that charmed investors. It was a promise, a threat. Later that day, I was called into HR. They handed me a formal notice. Effective immediately, I was suspended pending internal investigation. The words were cold, final. Richard had moved faster than I expected. He couldn't silence me completely. Not yet. But he could strip me of my badge, cut me off from my work, make me look like the problem. As I left the building, a security guard escorting me like a criminal, humiliation burned in my chest. People watched as I walked through the lobby. Some pitied me. Others smirked, glad it wasn't them. Richard stood on the mezzanine above, watching with that same dangerous smile. He thought he had won, but he was wrong. That night, I met quietly with someone I had been too afraid to approach before. Daniel Ross, a journalist I had known back in college. He had built a reputation for exposing corruption, the kind of man who wasn't afraid to take risks. I sent him a message from a burner phone asking for a meeting. We met in a small cafe on the edge of the city, far from the glass towers of Hale Dynamics. Daniel listened as I laid out the story, showing him copies of the files I still had. His eyes widened as he pieced it together. "Claire, this isn't just fraud," he whispered. "This is criminal. If this gets out, Richard won't just lose his company. He could go to prison." "That's why he's trying to bury me," I said. My voice shook, but not from fear, from determination. "He thinks he can scare me into silence, but I'm done being silent." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it carefully. He has lawyers, money, and influence. If you go alone, he'll crush you. But if we make this public, if we hit him with the truth in the open, he won't be able to hide." For the first time, I felt something like hope. I wasn't alone anymore, but hope came with a cost. Going public meant putting everything on the line: my career, my safety, even my future. Once this story broke, Richard wouldn't just come after me through the company. He would come after me personally. Back at my apartment, I sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. I thought of my parents again, of the sacrifices they had made to give me this life. I thought of the years I had spent working, the nights I had cried from exhaustion, the dreams I had once carried. I wasn't doing this just for me anymore. I was doing it for everyone who had ever been crushed under the heel of men like Richard Hale. The next day, I received another email, this time directly from Richard. No subject, no greeting. Just 6 words. "Walk away now or you'll regret it." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Then slowly I typed my reply. "See you soon, Richard, because this wasn't over." It was just beginning. The storm finally broke on a rainy Thursday morning. 2 weeks had passed since my suspension. 2 weeks in which Richard had tightened his grip on the company, thinking he had silenced me. But while he sat in his glass tower, playing the part of the untouchable CEO, Daniel and I were working in the shadows. We gathered everything: contracts, emails, offshore account details, even witness statements from former employees who had been too afraid to speak before. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The night before the story was published, Daniel called me. His voice was steady, but I could feel the weight of it. "Tomorrow morning, the world will know who Richard Hale really is." I barely slept that night. My heart raced as I imagined every outcome. The board turning against him, the stock crashing, the police arriving at his office. But beneath all the fear was something else, a quiet, steady strength. After months of being framed, humiliated, and hunted, I was finally taking control. At 8 a.m., the article went live, "The Empire of Lies: How Richard Hale Built Hale Dynamics on Fraud." Within minutes, it spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. News outlets picked it up. Investors panicked. Employees flooded group chats with messages of shock and disbelief. By noon, chaos had erupted inside the company. The board called an emergency meeting. Reporters swarmed the building. Richard's carefully crafted image shattered in real time. I wasn't inside the office anymore, but Daniel kept me updated every hour. "He's raging," he told me over the phone. "He's denying everything, but the documents are too strong. The board has no choice but to act." By the end of the day, it was official. Richard Hale was removed as CEO of Hale Dynamics. An internal investigation was launched, and the SEC opened a federal case against him. The empire he had built on lies collapsed in a single day, and me, the same people who had once whispered behind my back, now knew the truth. I wasn't the villain. I was the one who stood up when no one else dared. But victory didn't feel like fireworks. It felt quiet, heavy, like standing in the eye of a storm that had finally passed. I had lost so much, my job, my sense of safety, my peace of mind. But I had kept something more important, my integrity. A week later, I walked past the Hale Dynamics tower one last time. The glass walls reflected the gray sky, but the shine was gone. Inside, a new CEO was being appointed, someone who promised transparency, honesty, and reform. I didn't know if the company would truly change, but I knew one thing. Richard's reign was over. As for me, I wasn't the same quiet analyst who once kept her head down and worked late into the night. I had faced the storm and I had survived. My name was no longer a whisper of shame. It was proof that even against the most powerful, the truth could win. I paused on the sidewalk, watching the building fade behind me. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. The battle was over, and I had won. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't just my story. It was a reminder to anyone trapped under the weight of corruption, lies, or fear. Your voice matters. The truth matters. And silence only feeds the powerful. So if you've walked with me through this journey, if you've felt the fear, the struggle, and the fight for justice, don't let it end here. Subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. Stories of courage, betrayal, and the battles that shape us. Your support means everything, and together we'll keep the truth alive.